Welcome back, my name's Brandon, and today we're hopefully going to be installing some Z32 rear calipers on our S13. This will likely be a multi-day or possibly multi-video process, so please bear with me as things kind of jump around back and forth. I'm going to try to be as detailed as I can, but I want to make a disclaimer about this process. It's kind of a pain to put everything together for a working e-brake, which is what we're going to be doing with the Z32 rear calipers. It utilizes a drum parking brake underneath a disc rotor. One of your biggest problems is going to be tracking down a Z32 brake assembly, which is easier said than done. It's also going to be a little more costly than you might think it is. But with all that said, let's go ahead and jump right into this. This is a very involved upgrade that will be worthwhile for a daily driven car like my S13. To make this brake job possible, you're going to need an assortment of tools handy, which are listed in the description of this video. Best to have them all at the beginning, or you're going to be making many extra trips to various shops. The rear knuckle is going to need to be mostly disassembled. Remove your rear calipers with your 14 and 17mm sockets or wrenches. I found it helps to remove the retaining clip for the handbrake cable on the caliper for more freedom to move things around. Hang on to your 17mm bolts, as you'll need to reuse these to install the Z32 calipers. It's totally possible to install the Z32 calipers without a working handbrake, which I highly recommend if this is more of a track-oriented build. You won't need the handbrake assembly, only the calipers, rotors, pads, brake lines, and some modifications to the OEM dust shield. The OEM S13 rotor measures out to 10.2 inches, unlike the Z32 rotor, which comes in at 11.6 inches, which means the new Z32 rotor won't fit without some modifications to the original dust shield. It's totally possible to remove the dust shield altogether, but you might find it easier to just cut the shield down to fit. I'm doing a poor job of cutting my dust shield down just to give you a demonstration of how the rotor will fit. The Z32 rotor fits with some gentle persuasion from a hammer to the trimmed OEM dust shield. After this, all you would need to install is the caliper, pads, Z32 conversion brake lines, and bleed the system. Easy as. But this is my quote-unquote daily driven street car, and poor me just has to have a working handbrake. Next, the axle nut has to be removed. Simply remove the cotter pin and the nut cover to access the 36mm nut. If you don't have a powerful impact gun handy to break the axle nut loose, use the e-brake to keep the hub from spinning, or set the car back on the ground if the hub diameter of your wheels are big enough to accommodate the 36mm socket. Once you have the axle nut loose, unwind it until it reaches the end of the axle stud. In the likely event that you will need to gently hammer the axle out of the hub later, the nut will keep you from destroying your threads. You'll need a couple of 19mm sockets or wrenches to remove the control arm bolts. An impact makes this quick work. Don't forget to undo the 17mm coilover nut from the knuckle when you go to disassemble it. Be mindful of your ball joints. You don't want to destroy them by moving your assembly around too much. But if you need to replace them, now's a good time as any to do it. Check out the previous video for insight on how to tackle replacing S13 rear lower ball joints. I found it necessary to unbolt the lower control arm altogether so I could freely access all sides of the knuckle assembly. All this takes is more 19mm. The main reason behind removing the knuckle is to access the hub bolts in the back, which can't be reached easily with the axle in place. Removing these 4 19mm bolts will allow us to remove the OE dust shield and replace it with the 300ZX dust shield needed to run a proper handbrake. An impact gun is going to make this job so much easier. Certainly not a required tool, but your body will thank you. Of course I forgot to film this part, but after you get those 4 bolts off, you're going to need to separate the hub from the knuckle. There's 2 ways to do this. Ideally, you would have a press and press the hub out because it is pressed into the knuckle. If you don't have a press, you're going to have to hammer your way out using a pretty large socket so that you don't damage the bearing in the back or scar anything in the back. Now there's lots of ways you can do this, but the way I went about it is setting this face down into a kitty litter box, because I have about 4 or 5 of those sitting here in the garage. It's great to place that in there, put the socket on top, and hammer away with a quite heavy mallet or hammer. Is this held up well? Luckily I have a ball joint press on hand that has these extra large sockets, but just use what you can to get those separated. Now since I have everything in pieces, I figured now would be a good time to go ahead and rattle can everything black. That way we can hide all the 30 years of corrosion and get rid of any rust that's built up on the control arms and the knuckle. And I think it's going to look way better once it's in there. But the problem is, it's so cold, I gotta let the paint cure for probably a couple days, so we're gonna return to this soon and get everything put back together. While everything was apart, the lower control arms were treated to some paint and a fresh set of ball joints. So for whatever reason, I've had a hell of a time trying to press this bolt into the knuckle. obviously I want to put the dust shield in between them since this bolt seems just like a little bit too big for the knuckle. I actually measured it, and my knuckle has an opening of about 19.5 mil, whereas this bolt measures out to be about 20 mils. So I've been having to hammer this in gently so that I don't misalign this pin. I've been using the bearing press. I've been using the ball joint press to press this into the joint, but it's been taking me about 20 minutes and there's still about half an inch of play in there. So I'm hoping I can get this hammered down in there. If anything would bolt up, I figured this would be a part to do it. Maybe it's because it's cold. I'm currently heating up the other one so that maybe it'll press in a little easier. But just be aware of that. Hopefully yours isn't as big of a pain. I'm not sure why they're not lining up. I figure all Z32 parts will bolt onto an S13 knuckle, but maybe that's not the case and I've just misheard. So here are all the pieces you're going to need, all the small pieces. I'll send you a link to find some of these smaller pieces that you can get. Be aware that that's a plate and a spring with a little spear on it so it hooks into the dust shield. This guy was a little hard to find. It was missing, but I was able to find it on eBay. As I said, I'll try to find links for all of these pieces. This is the part I've been heating up because I believe this diameter to be too big for my knuckle, and I don't think it was a problem with paint because I had already drilled all that out or sanded it all down from the inside. Oh yeah, don't forget this guy right here. So just wanted to show you real quickly all of the parts you'll probably need to put all of this together. Hopefully this is everything I need. Almost forgot about this spring here. Since I'm without a proper hydraulic press and only have hammers on hand, my only choice is to carefully whack the anchor bolts into the knuckle. I want to be careful not to warp the pin at the end, as any blunt force will surely snap it off clean. So I'm using various pieces from a ball joint press I have on hand to protect the pin and redirect the force of the hammer blows to the body of the anchor bolt. As you can see, I've opted for the Speed Academy method and trimmed most of my dust shield down for maximum cooling of the brake rotors. I did build this car to one day see the track, so here's to hoping that work one day pays off. Be warned, if you opt to trim your dust shield down, which is very unnecessary for a daily driver, you're going to need some strong shears or tin snips, as a couple sheets of metal overlap in certain spots of the dust shield. Next, we get to reinstall the hub assembly back on the knuckle. When you're tightening down the 19mm bolts in the back, make sure to do this in short increments to get the hub to seat flat on the knuckle. All bolts need to be torqued down to 60 to 70 foot-pounds. If you've disconnected the knuckle from the lower control arm, you'll need to torque it back down to 50 foot-pounds using a 21 or 22mm socket depending on whether or not you've replaced your ball joint. Unfortunately here, I didn't protect the axle threads when I hammered them out of the knuckle, so I'm going to need to replace my 5-bolt axle shaft with one from a 1993 Infiniti J30. Welcome back to day 2 of the Z32 Caliper install. Today we're going to be tackling the brake calipers and maybe even potentially finishing the job today. So what we're going to need is some Z32 2+2 cables for our S13. They might be bolt-on, but just in case they're not, I've gone ahead and picked up Straight Faction's brake cable adapter plate, so that'll bolt up nicely once we get everything mounted up. First things first, we got to drop the drive shaft and remove our old e-brake cables because they're not going to work for our drum brake assembly that we have now currently mounted on our rear knuckles. So now we've got our drive shaft dropped. Now we have to unbolt the e-brake cable on this bolt here, same on the other side. And we'll also undo the bolt. If we can get the light under here. Over right there, there's a little bolt hanging onto that bracket up there, so bolting it to the subframe, so we gotta take that out as well. 4 bolts total. Then we can wiggle out our little clips from the e-brake itself and get them out of there. After dropping the tail end of your drive shaft using 12 or 13mm wrenches, bust out your trusty 10mm tool that you keep locked away in your treasure chest to remove the handbrake cables, as these won't work with the new drum assembly due to differences in length and cable lengths. So here we have the old and new brake cables lined up for comparison purposes. You can see the end start here. There's a difference in the length for the bracket right there to hook up to the chassis, which is where this will come into play. Then these about line up in the same spot. We may have to do some finagling to realign this so it mounts up to the subframe. And we can see up here on the ends, these parts are different right here. So it's a different mechanism to engage the e-brake, obviously. So it's a good thing we have our Z32 2+2 cables on hand. Bolt up your street fraction bracket so you can read it and the top end of the letters face towards the front of the car. You can easily fab up your own bracket if you have the tools, but companies like Street Faction and GK Tech have taken the time to do the math and fab up their own brackets which won't flex under use. They take the guesswork and the extra time out of the equation. That equals money well spent for me and a solid win in my book. These cables provide a grommet that allows them to be routed through a provided hole in the subframe, so be mindful of the way you lay them to maximize reachability to the drum assembly. It's another day and we're continuing on with our Z32 Caliper install adventure journey, and it's getting to be a long one, and I've made an important discovery on the anchor bolts for our Z32 assembly. So the anchor bolt, which is this guy right here and sits on top of the Z32 assembly and keeps the shoes held together, also kind of anchors everything into place. There's two different kinds of these guys. There's the twin turbo anchor bolt, which I have in my hand here. It's got a little thinner profile. What we need for bolting onto S13s and S14s is an NA300ZX anchor bolt, which I hear can be quite hard to find. And it explains why I had such a horrible time hammering these into my knuckle. So now I've had the joy of hammering this guy back out to see what I could do to remedy this problem without having to try to find another anchor bolt. I can't talk, it's cold in here. Unfortunately, I didn't realize this until I had already tried to bolt up some of the e-brake pieces together just so I could get a feel and show you guys how to properly do it the next go around on the other side of the car. Now it might be a little difficult to see on here, but you can see the drum shoe hits up against the hub back here. We need the entire assembly to wrap around this anchor bolt right here. Now if we try to line up our shoe guide, push it in here, it's going to push these shoes back farther against the hub and push it out, so it's not actually going to be sitting on this anchor. It's going to push this up here, which is where it was before. Now I wasn't quite sure why this plate was so loose in here jiggling around, but now I know why. This anchor bolt is pressed too far into the hub and it needs to come out about ½ an inch. Now I hope that much makes sense to you guys. Luckily I came across a video by R60ness. I'll be sure to put her video in the description down below, thank you very much. Essentially the solution that she came up with was to just manufacture her own spacing brackets or washers and put them between the anchor bolt and the dust shield itself. So I've gone ahead and gone to Home Depot, picked up some tubing. It's about an inch wide, 1/16 thick, just normal steel. I couldn't find any normal tubing, so I got some square steel beams. Her video recommended about 7/16 in height. I wanted a little bigger than that, just measuring it up, kind of mocking it on the drum assembly, seeing kind of what I would need. And this came out to be about 5/8, which is a little bigger than ½ an inch, obviously. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna try it. Hopefully everything goes well. Alright guys, I think we're at a pretty good spot. So I've just finished one side, and this is pretty much how I ideally want it to look. We've got the adjuster down there, a little spring, big spring. I just kind of wanted to give you guys an overall goal towards what we're working toward here, and I will go through it in detail on the other side on how to put all of this together. Now as pointed out before, this is easiest to do with the hub assembly off so that you can access all the springs and brackets and place them in the weird gimmicky places that they need to be. So now I get to tear apart the other side that I had incorrectly assembled, and we get to start from scratch. Now we can finally reassemble our knuckle with all the proper Z32 handbrake pieces needed. First, our maximum heat extracting Z32 dust shield will be placed on the knuckle, followed by the insertion of our twin turbo anchor bolt with its 5/8 inch spacer into the knuckle. With a little love from our trusty mallet and the protection of a large socket to keep the end pin from snapping, the bolt slowly makes its way into its new home. Now we can torque the anchor bolt down with its corresponding 1-inch nut with a few ugga-duggas. After torquing the knuckle back to the lower control arm, we can flop our brand new 5-bolt axle into the empty hub space so we can reassemble our Z32 drum pieces. Snake your fresh OEM brake cables through the lower hole of the dust shield and tighten its bracket to the back of the shield using one of the 10mm nuts in your bin of Z32 parts. Tighten her down well, don't spin too hard or you'll risk stripping the threads. Next, take the drum shoe with the extra hook leg and hook it to the end of the cable. You can then take that cable spring and compress it into the rest of the rearward side of the cable guide on the shield. Look to your Z32 parts and assemble one short round spring, a bolt retaining washer, and an arrow-like pin together. You'll use this to attach the drum shoe to the dust shield. Once you have everything lined up, use a flathead screwdriver to compress the spring and twist the arrow-tipped pin so that it locks the shoe into place. You'll do the same for the other drum shoe to secure it into position. Next comes the big fat clip with its corresponding spring. Orient it so the singular long leg faces towards the rear of the car, and place the spring towards the front of the car. After placing your retaining clip on the anchor bolt, you can now place the L-shaped springs into position. I found a flathead screwdriver helps best. Now you can position the normal looking S-shaped spring into place toward the bottom of the drum shoes. Finally, the adjuster can be squeezed in. This will allow you to expand your drum shoes to take up any slack in the handbrake. I'm not sure that it matters, but I positioned mine so that the threaded end faces towards the rear of the car. Now do a little dance and give yourself a pat on the back for now and observe all your hard-earned work. But we're not out of trouble yet. We still need to reassemble the rest of our rear suspension. Grab your hub and torque her down to the knuckle. Then you can slip in your axle and line up all your control arms. It's said to be a good idea to torque your control arms down while the whole system is compressed for proper alignment. I finally placed the massive P2M 11.6 inch rotors on so I can install the rear Z32 calipers right before I run into more trouble. Alright guys, I'm not sure what day it is, so my facial hair is any indication of how long this project's been going on for. It's been entirely too long, so really just wanting to finish this. Unfortunately, one of my brake line nuts, trying to change the brake lines to the conversion lines for the rear, has stripped. Now I have to find a way to get that rounded bolt or nut off. We're gonna have to make a new flare, which I can show you how to do in this video. So it hasn't taken me long, but I finally decided I'm done messing around with this thing. So we're gonna do the most unrecommended move for removing brake lines, and just take a sawzall to this guy right at the end, and I'm gonna reflare it, take off the other end at our connection right here, where I am applying some PB Blaster, and then we'll reflare it. Okay, good? Okay, good. Alright, so we got the hard line out, but I realized after I'd done the damage already that there's an easier way to go about it than sawzawing your hard line out, and that is just undoing the other side where the T-connector connects all the hard lines together in the back, and just snake it through that little clamp that connects the brake line and your hard line together. Then you can take some clamps and try to get the knot off then, rather than destroying your precious hard line, because there's not a lot of this. Luckily I think I'll be able to stretch this after I put another nut on there, and we'll get it done. The damage is done, but just go the better route than I did. I let the frustrations get the better of me, although I will say it's kind of taken a long time. I just want to get this done. It's been too long. This is why you should never attempt to disconnect brake lines without a proper sized flare nut wrench. Now we have to make new flares with a questionable kit from Harbor Freight. Please note, there are better tools out there for this job. I'm simply sharing with you what I did to finish the job. First step is removing the flared end so you can remove the flared nut. It's important to have a straight line when cutting it down with a pipe cutter, because an uneven cut means an uneven flare that won't properly seal and cause brake pressure loss. After the line is cut, don't forget to remove the old flare nut and add the new replacement. I'll line up the 3/16 inch hard line in the appropriate spot on the flare maker thing so that it's sticking past the machine at the height of the supplied 3/16 inch die, and tighten it down so that the line doesn't slip. Then I'll place the 3/16 inch die in the line before compressing it slowly and evenly with the compressor thing supplied. After the die bottoms out, loosen the compressor and remove the die so you can slowly compress the line to a 45-degree angle. And there we have it, a questionably flared line that hopefully won't prove to be the reason of my or this car's death. Alright, we finally got our hard line placed in back there. Got our stainless steel braided lines in, hooked all up to our caliper. Now I did have a bit of problems with the rotor coming in contact with the caliper itself, but I was able to make that go away by tightening up my lug nuts and making sure this was in place. I was a little worried that the hub wasn't all the way seated into the knuckle, but everything's good. Just needed to tighten this up. But look at that. So amazing. Stuff definitely a huge difference between these two rotors. Putting them side by side, I believe this is like a 9-inch rotor, whereas this is a 11-inch rotor. Fun fact, the rear rotors are actually bigger in diameter from the front 300ZX rotors, and I suspect that's because of all the drum brake assembly that's hidden underneath the rotor housing itself. Before I get to install my new massive calipers, I'm going to clean up all of the caliper hardware that's been blackened by previous daily driven mileage. All it takes is some trusty brake cleaner and a fresh rag. After installing the Z32 calipers with the bleeders on top, brand new Hawk HPS pads can be installed with the cleaned hardware. Don't forget to grease up the hardware with some brake grease to help minimize any squeaks in the brake system, although with certain types of pads, this is pretty unavoidable. The pad I'm running will be great for street duties that see some occasional small track use. Now we can finally tackle the front brakes, which will be an absolute breeze coming from the rears. The process is just the same as the rears, aside from having no handbrake cable to undo. It's not a bad idea to hang the caliper so the brake line isn't under any stress. We're not installing the bigger calipers just yet, so we want to minimize any brake fluid loss by undoing the brake lines at the very end. Remove the rotor along with the hub nut cover if you plan on removing the front dust shield as well. It's possible to cut the dust shield down like the rears and not have to remove the cover, but I'm going for all-out Speed Academy spec. The cotter pin needs to be removed before I can access the 30mm hub nut. After that, the hub comes straight off like butter. You'll need something to pry the dust shield off as it seems to be pressed onto the assembly. The shield will likely be unusable after removal, so once it's off, there's no going back. Everything goes back in the same order. I can now install my Z32 rotors, increasing rotor diameter from 9.8 inches to 11 inches, and increasing thickness to 30mm. It's worth mentioning that these Phase 2 Motor Trend front and rear rotors allow me to keep my 4-lug configuration without having to upgrade to 5 lugs, though they can be a bit pricey. Time to compress the pistons so we can load the caliper with squeaky-clean hardware and new pads. Be careful not to mar the piston boots.
At the place you call here and now.
I was unsure of how much caliper grease to put on, but a good friend of mine named Nico Forum said, "If you're scared you put too much on, it's probably not enough. Just make sure you don't get any on the friction side of the pads." As said before, be generous with PP Blaster, and never ever ever attempt to remove a brake line without a flare nut wrench. 90% of the time, you'll round that brake line nut. So we finally have the front brakes put back together. Everything's done on the front, everything's done on the rear. Now the final thing we have to do, which I'm going to be skipping at this point, is swapping out the master cylinder for the 300ZX, either 1-inch or the 17/16 master cylinder. It's better for a stopping feel, but I'm really curious to see how bad the stock cylinder is going to hold up to all these brakes. I have the 300ZX cylinder on hand, but I'm really just curious to see what that feedback's like, and I'll go into swapping that in another video. For today, we're going to go on ahead to bleeding all of these brakes. Unless you have some sort of speed bleeder, you're going to need a friend, or a capable human, to help you with this part. One person needs to be in the driver's seat to pump the brake pedal until it gets firm, and then hold the pedal down. The other person will connect a clear tube to the bleeders on top of the caliper and use a flare nut wrench to unscrew the bleeder until air or brake fluid comes out while the pedal is held down. Once air or liquid has bled, turn the bleeder back so it's tightened down, then the pedal can be released. Repeat this process until you can't see any air coming out of the system and brake pedal feel is firm. Even small air bubbles can create a spongy brake feel or possible brake failure, so you want to make sure to get all of the air out of the system. Don't forget to keep the brake master cylinder topped off because you don't want air getting sucked into the system from the cylinder. The correct order in which this should be completed for any 240SX is driver rear to passenger front to driver front. In essence, you need to start at the caliper furthest from the brake master cylinder in regards to brake lines. We finally have the brakes all bled out. There was some nasty crud in those brake lines, so glad to have all of that dirt and air out of the systems. And we can finally go bed these things into the rotors and test the system out. Can't wait to do it, but I think that's going to be it for this video. I have no idea how long it's going to be, but it's going to be probably one of my longest videos yet, so I'm going to close it out here. If you guys got anything out of the video at all, please be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave them down below. I'll catch you guys next time. Have a great day.